The Labyrinth of Power. From survival strategies to the global trade of conflict. In a modern world where technology and bureaucracy appear to make all things rational and verifiable, the undeniable truth remains. The livelihoods of vast populations are still tethered to the decisions of a mere handful of leaders, particularly in highly centralized states. Political psychologist David Owen once described the Hubris Syndrome as a condition where leaders who hold power for extended periods begin to believe in their own infallibility, gradually severing themselves from information that contradicts their beliefs. This phenomenon has surfaced repeatedly throughout history, from Napoleon before the 1812 invasion of Moscow, to Hitler in the final stages of World War II, and to modern heads of state who gamble their nation's futures on military strategies or trade wars without regard for the social cost. When checks and balances are weakened, national budgets can be diverted from welfare, education, and infrastructure toward weapons programs that offer no direct economic return. Data from the World Bank clearly indicates that nations with a high ratio of defense spending to GDP but low labor productivity often face inflation and public debt rising significantly faster than the global average. The Russia-Ukraine conflict. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine serves as a contemporary archetype of what political scientists call the security dilemma, where friction arises not necessarily from the inherent malice of one party, but from each side interpreting the other's defensive actions as an existential threat. From the Russian perspective, the expansion of NATO toward its borders is viewed as an encroachment upon the near abroad, bliznai zarubazai, a term Russia uses to describe former Soviet satellite states it considers its sphere of influence. A strategic sanctuary where no other superpower may intervene. Conversely, from the Ukrainian perspective, historical experience renders the pursuit of security guarantees from the West a matter of survival rather than provocation. They assert their right as a sovereign nation to choose their own allies without seeking a neighbor's permission. This event mirrors the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States vehemently rejected the placement of Soviet weapons near its borders, despite Cuba's theoretical sovereign right to choose its partners. The staggering losses in Ukraine, including a GDP contraction of over 29% in 2022 and the displacement of over 10 million people, demonstrate that the cost of clashing sovereignty and strategic paranoia is a burden far too heavy for the common citizen to bear. The accumulation of arms. On the other hand, the buildup of weaponry is not always the result of a leader's ambition. Often, it is a consequence of structural pressures within the international system and the reality of facing aggressive despots in neighboring states. The concept of deterrence rests on the premise that possessing a credible retaliatory capability reduces the likelihood of being invaded. Paradoxically, history suggests that nations with a clear minimum military capacity often face a lower risk of full-scale war than those that are weak. Data from SIPRI indicates that global military spending has continued to rise, reaching approximately $2.72 trillion in 2024 to 2025. However, the lesson from states that consistently spend over 4 to 5% of their GDP on defense without a strong industrial or export base, such as the Soviet Union in the 1980s, clearly shows that such a burden can hollow out an economy to the point of collapse. The origins of defense budgets. The critical issue surrounding defense budgets and the role of the international monetary system can be explained through complex economic realities. Governments of small and medium-sized nations generally allocate defense funds from domestic tax revenue, which is contingent upon their economic structure and productive capacity. If a nation possesses a robust manufacturing and export base, export earnings become a vital factor, allowing the government to fund both defense and public welfare simultaneously. Conversely, nations heavily reliant on imports with weak production bases may face balance of payment pressures and must borrow foreign currency to fund military expenditures, effectively trading the blood, sweat, and tears of their citizens for security at a time when their fiscal foundation is not yet ready. For an economic superpower like the United States, a primary factor in managing immense debt is the status of the US dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. Approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are still held in dollars, Reuters. This status allows the U.S. to borrow at lower interest rates and maintain higher fiscal flexibility than any other nation. Even as the U.S. national debt climbed toward $36.38 trillion by 2025, surpassing 100% of its GDP, U.S. military spending remained the highest in the world. In 2025, the defense budget stood at approximately $962 billion, or about 13 to 14% of the total federal budget. This ability to run continuous deficit spending frequently raises questions about its broader impact on the global economy. The profound link that directly affects smaller nations is the mechanism by which the dollar flows into the global economy, which can be explained in stages. When the U.S. government pursues a deficit policy, whether for military, economic stimulus, or large-scale state projects, it issues government bonds to raise funds. During many periods, the Federal Reserve buys these bonds through monetary policy, resulting in the creation of new dollars injected into the economy. These newly created dollars do not merely circulate within the U.S., they flow out into the global system through international trade, financial markets, and cross-border capital movements because the dollar remains the primary currency for settling goods, energy, and central bank reserves worldwide. The result is that the volume of dollars in the global financial system increases simultaneously, not just in the country of origin. According to basic economic principles, when the money supply grows faster than the growth of goods and services, the value per unit of currency inevitably decreases. While the dollar may still appear strong compared to other currencies in terms of exchange rates, its actual purchasing power often declines. An excess of dollars in the system typically causes the price of dollar-denominated commodities, such as oil, food, and industrial metals, to rise. This means $1 can buy less than before. This is where the ripple effects of a superpower's monetary policy begin to reach smaller nations. Small and medium-sized nations holding large amounts of dollars as reserves fall into a difficult trap. If they choose to keep holding dollars, the numerical value of their reserves may stay the same, but the actual purchasing power drops. These nations can import fewer goods than before, resulting in a silent loss caused by dollar inflation. In economics, this is known as the inflation tax. It isn't collected directly by anyone, but the value of the held currency is eroded over time. On the other hand, if a country tries to reduce its dollar holdings by selling them, its local currency may appreciate too rapidly, damaging export competitiveness, causing financial market volatility, and increasing the risk of foreign capital flight. In practice, smaller nations have virtually no freedom to choose a truly painless path. Further expansion on the mechanism. When the volume of dollars in the global system increases to the point where its purchasing power drops, inflationary depreciation, it often triggers volatility in financial markets. This hits small and medium nations through the mechanism of capital flight. Institutional investors reduce their holdings in smaller countries and move capital back to assets perceived as safe havens. This process causes local currencies in smaller nations to be sold off rapidly, not because their economic fundamentals collapsed overnight, but because of sell-side pressure to convert assets into dollar liquidity. When a local currency weakens too fast, the impact cascades into the price of essential imports, foreign debt burdens, and public confidence. Under these circumstances, central banks in smaller nations often must use their foreign reserves to sell dollars and buy back their local currency to slow the depreciation and prevent economic panic. A key question that often causes confusion is, if the dollar is losing value due to inflation, why do investors still sell local currencies to buy dollars? This misunderstanding stems from viewing the dollar in only one dimension. In reality, the dollar serves two distinct roles. The yardstick for goods. When inflation occurs, the dollar weakens because it buys fewer things. The ultimate safe haven. In times of global crisis or war, investors do not worry about how many burgers $1 can buy. They worry about whether their $1 million will still exist and be available for withdrawal. In a destabilized world, the US dollar and Treasury bonds remain the most liquid assets with the lowest risk of default. Thus, the dollar can weaken in terms of purchasing power, buying more expensive goods, while simultaneously strengthening against other currencies as everyone rushes to hold it, without contradiction. However, relying solely on reserve intervention is unsustainable if capital outflow persists. Smaller nations are often forced to use tight monetary policies, such as raising interest rates, to incentivize investors to hold the local currency. While these measures may stabilize the currency in the short term, they come at a high cost to the domestic economy, slowed investment, increased household debt, and a soaring cost of living. This reflects a structural reality. In a global financial system tethered to the dollar, smaller nations must bear the consequences of superpower policies, regardless of how disciplined their own economic management may be. Neutrality. There exist compelling strategies such as the neutrality practiced by Switzerland and Austria. Switzerland, in particular, has maintained a policy of neutrality since 1815 through a system of armed neutrality that is deeply integrated into its social fabric. This means every citizen is part of the defense. Swiss men keep their service weapons at home, ready for immediate mobilization. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, and tunnels, is designed to be rigged for demolition to cut off enemy supply lines, and nuclear fallout shelters exist for 100% of the population. This forces any superpower to calculate that the cost of invading a country where every square inch is a trap and every citizen is a partisan is far higher than any potential gain. Austria, meanwhile, accepted permanent neutrality in 1955 in exchange for the restoration of its sovereignty. Both nations prove that true sovereignty lies in using diplomacy to avoid war, allowing resources to be funneled into the quality of life for their citizens, consistently ranking them among the world's best. In cases where a state can transform military burdens into a foundation for innovation, such as Israel, the importance of budget management is further emphasized. Israel has faced instability since its founding in 1948, forcing it to invest in R&D at a rate exceeding 5% of its GDP. Youth trained in the military's technological units bring those skills to create a thriving cyber startup industry. Similarly, South Korea evolved from an impoverished agrarian nation after the Korean War into a heavy industrial powerhouse through self-reliant strategies and technology transfer, eventually becoming a major global arms exporter. This proves that if a state treats its defense budget as an investment in productivity, security and prosperity can advance hand in hand, profiting from conflict. Nevertheless, on the flip side, we often encounter the complex game of major arms manufacturers who thrive on conflict by fostering environments of paranoia. When a superpower exports long-range weaponry to one country, it disrupts the local balance of power, triggering panic in neighboring nations that then rush to procure similar armaments from the same manufacturers. This phenomenon is a cycle of debt and distrust controlled by arms dealers. This influence is further embedded into the power structure because buyers remain dependent on spare parts and software upgrades for the duration of the equipment's life. Superpowers use this lock-in to anchor the foreign policy of the purchasing nation. Should they resist, a once mighty military could be reduced to a pile of immobile scrap metal overnight. The current phenomenon of de-dollarization acts as a tremor beneath the pillar that sustains limitless military power. As more nations shift to local currencies for energy settlements, the global demand for dollars decreases. This forces superpowers into a position where they must truly choose between weapons of war and the livelihoods of their people for the first time in decades. If this trend accelerates, rising borrowing costs will force superpowers to downsize their militaries as they can no longer sustain the expense, while smaller nations will begin to gain more financial bargaining power. Ultimately, the line between a resilient state and a chronically fragile one is not drawn by the quantity of its hardware, but by its ability to integrate security policy with economic structure and human capital development. History shows that victory is not decided on the battlefield alone, but is determined by the financial endurance and productive capacity of the state in the long run. Only those states capable of converting security pressures into a catalyst for innovation can truly escape the labyrinth of power and move toward a sustainable stability, without sacrificing the welfare or the dignity of their people.